Ever opened up a container of leftovers and been met with something a little fuzzy and unappetizing?
Oh, yeah, we've all been there.
Well, today we're taking a deep dive into the world of food microbiology, that hidden world of microbes that can determine if our food is a delicious meal or a science experiment.
That's right. It really is fascinating, this invisible universe of bacteria and yeasts and molds that are impacting every single thing we eat.
And we're not going in blind.
Yeah.
You've brought some great resources for this deep dive.
Yeah, we've got excerpts from a classic food microbiology textbook, so we've got the fundamentals covered.
It's a real student staple, this one.
Yeah, for sure. Plus, I've brought some recent research articles to keep things cutting edge.
I like it. So we'll be exploring where these microbes are coming from.
And spoiler alert, they're pretty much everywhere.
And of course, we'll look at what makes them grow, things like temperature and pH, and how all of this ties into keeping food safe and preserving it.
It all comes back to our health in the end, doesn't it?
It really does. Okay, well, let's start with the basics then. We need to appreciate just how widespread these microorganisms really are.
They really are. I mean, just think about it. Air, soil, water, plants, animals, they're teeming with these tiny life forms.
I guess we could compare them to those friends who seem to pop up everywhere you go.
Right. But they're microscopic.
Exactly, the ultimate party crashers. And when it comes to food spoilage, well, they're the ones leading the charge.
Yeah, turning that delicious pizza into something you definitely don't want to eat anymore.
It really is the bane of every leftovers container, isn't it?
It is. But here's the thing, not all microbes are bad. In fact, some of them are essential.
I mean, think about fermentation. That's driven by microbes.
Exactly. And we harness them to make so many things: cheese, yogurt, bread, beer.
Oh, that's a good point. So it's like we've got this mix of the good, the bad, and the downright fuzzy.
And understanding those differences is key.
Absolutely. But how can we tell which microbes are going to throw a party in our food and which ones are going to be well-behaved guests?
It all boils down to a number of factors that influence their activity, some of which are intrinsic, meaning part of the food itself.
And then we've got the extrinsic factors, the things in the surrounding environment, right?
That's right. So let's start with what's happening inside the food itself, those intrinsic factors.
All right, lead the way.
Well, one of the most important is what nutrients are in the food. Just like us, different microbes have different dietary needs.
So some prefer a sugar-rich diet. Others might thrive on proteins.
Exactly. Some even break down fats.
Because it's all about what's on the menu.
You could say that. The type of food dictates which microbes are going to show up.
So a juicy steak is going to attract a different crowd than a bowl of fruit salad.
Precisely. Then we have another big player, pH, the acidity or alkalinity of the food,
Yeah, that makes sense. Acidity affects how enzymes work.
which then impacts how those microbes grow.
Right, which explains why acidic foods like citrus fruits tend to last longer.
Yeah, low pH creates a tough environment for those microbes. Imagine trying to have a picnic in the middle of a storm.
Not very appealing. Okay, so we've got the nutrients, the pH. What else?
Well, there's water activity. That's a big one. It's all about how available water is for those microbes to actually use.
So even if water is present, it might not be in a form that microbes can easily access.
That's it. It's like the difference between a dry sponge and a damp one. One can soak up a lot more water, right?
Yeah, that makes sense.
A lot of preservation methods like drying or salting actually work by lowering the water activity.
Basically making the food less hospitable to those microbes.
That's the idea. And we can't forget about the plant's own defenses, plant antimicrobials.
Oh, right. So plants can actually fight back against those microbial invaders.
They sure can. Some plants naturally produce compounds that inhibit microbial growth.
Like a built-in defense system.
Exactly. Take cranberries, for example. They've got benzoic acid, a natural preservative.
Interesting. And what about all those wonderful spices we love?
Spices are often packed with antimicrobial compounds. Think of cloves, cinnamon. They've been used for centuries, not just for flavor, but also for preservation.
Especially in warmer climates where things spoil more quickly.
It's like they're fighting off those microbes while also making the food delicious.
It's a win-win. So we've covered those intrinsic factors, the internal environment of the food. But what about the external factors? What's going on outside the food that can impact those microbial party crashers?
Well, temperature is probably the most important one.
Temperature's got to be a big factor.
It is. Different microbes have different temperature preferences. That's why we categorize them as psychrotrophs, the cold lovers, mesophiles, the moderate temperature folks.
And then there's the thermophiles, the real heat seekers.
You got it. And that's why refrigeration is so important for food safety.
It's all about slowing down those mesophiles, the ones that cause spoilage.
Yeah, you could think of it as hitting the snooze button on their growth cycle.
But we can't forget about freezing.
Right, and freezing does slow down microbial growth. It's like putting them in a state of suspended animation.
But they're not necessarily gone for good, are they?
Nope, some of those microbes are incredibly resilient and can survive those freezing temperatures.
So it's not a total microbial knockout. And I remember reading that the rate of freezing also plays a role.
It does. Fast freezing is generally better because it creates smaller ice crystals, which cause less damage to those food cells.
So those slower freezing processes can lead to larger ice crystals that can rupture those cells.
Exactly, and that can impact the texture of the food after it thaws.
Okay, so it's not just about reaching that freezing temperature, it's about the journey.
The how is important. And then we've got relative humidity, which ties in with that water activity we talked about
Oh,
earlier.
yes. So if you store bread in a humid environment, it's
Yeah.
more likely to go moldy faster.
That's because that high humidity increases the water activity on the bread surface. It's creating a more inviting space for those mold spores to germinate.
So controlling those external factors is just as important as what's going on in the food itself. It's like a multi-layered battle.
It is. We're playing a microbial game of chess, and we need to think several moves ahead. And finally, there's a role of gases, especially oxygen.
Right. Just like with temperature, different microbes have different oxygen needs.
Some need it to survive, those are the aerobes. Others can't stand at the anaerobes.
And then there are the facultative anaerobes, the ones that can switch between both depending on what's available.
They're pretty adaptable, aren't they?
They are. And I'm guessing this whole oxygen thing plays into things like modified atmosphere packaging.
You bet. By tweaking the gas composition inside those packages, we can really extend the shelf life of so many foods.
Like those prepackaged salads.
Exactly. It might involve reducing oxygen to hold back the aerobes, or maybe increasing carbon dioxide to inhibit microbial growth.
So it's all about creating an environment that's not very welcoming to those spoilage microbes. So we've talked about the microbial world and the things that makes them tick, so to speak. But now let's look at how we actually apply this knowledge to make sure our food stays safe and delicious. I'm talking about food preservation.
Yeah, we've got a whole arsenal of techniques, both ancient and modern, that we use to combat those microbial forces and make our food last longer.
I'm ready to explore this microbial battleground. Let's dig in.
It's really amazing when you think about it, how people have managed to keep food safe for so long.
Oh, absolutely. And a lot of those preservation methods, both the old and the new, come back to manipulating the factors we just discussed.
Exactly. Nutrients, pH, the water activity, temperature, oxygen. It's like we're trying to outsmart those microbes.
Yeah, it's a microbial game of chess.
That's a great way to put it. So why don't we look at some of the main ways we preserve food, starting with heat processing.
Okay, and when I hear heat processing, I instantly think of pasteurization.
It's a classic for a reason, right?
Oh, yeah, it's everywhere, especially for things like milk.
Yeah, pasteurization uses a gentle heat to eliminate a lot of the microbes that cause spoilage and those that could make us sick.
It's a game changer. Really longer shelf life without really changing the taste or losing all the good stuff in the food.
Exactly. And it's different from sterilization, which uses much higher temperatures.
Yeah, I remember that from my food science classes. Sterilization is like the ultimate weapon against those microbes.
It is. We're talking high temperatures and pressure to wipe out almost all microorganisms.
It's often used for things like canned goods where you need that long-term stability.
Right, because those cans need to sit on the shelf for ages without spoiling. But that intense heat can sometimes affect the flavor and texture of the food.
So it's a trade-off, long shelf life, but maybe some changes to the taste?
Sometimes, but the safety is paramount. Speaking of canned foods, let's talk about the canning process itself.
I've always been curious about that. There's some serious science behind it, right? Making sure those cans are safe to eat.
Yeah, definitely. Canning is all about creating an airtight environment so no oxygen can get in, and then applying heat to kill off those microbes.
And that's where those D values come in, right?
You remember those?
Vaguely. It stands for decimal reduction time, and it's all about how much heat it takes to kill those microbes, right?
You got it. It measures how long it takes at a specific temperature to wipe out 90% of a microbial population.
Okay, so if a microbe has a D value of, say, 5 minutes at 121 degrees Celsius.
Then it would take 5 minutes at that temperature to eliminate 90% of them.
Wow, that's pretty precise.
It has to be. Scientists use these D values to calculate the exact heating times for different foods.
So they can ensure those canned foods are safe to eat.
Exactly. They figure out the D values for the toughest microbes likely to be in a particular food, take into account the size of the container, and then calculate the processing time and temperature needed.
It's like a microbial puzzle, figuring out how to eliminate those tiny threats.
And it's particularly important for low-acid foods,
Oh, right, because those can be more prone to dangerous bacteria.
like Clostridium botulinum, the one that causes botulism.
That's definitely one we want to avoid. So those canned peaches or beans we see on the shelves have a whole lot of science behind them.
A whole lot of math and microbiology going on behind the scenes. But heat isn't the only way we preserve food. There are also non-thermal methods.
Oh, right, like freezing, which is super popular these days.
Yeah, freezing definitely slows down microbial growth.
I like to think of it as putting those microbes on pause.
It's like a microbial time out. But remember, freezing doesn't necessarily kill all of them.
Some can survive those chilly temperatures and spring back to life when the food thaws.
They're a hardy bunch. And did you know that the rate of freezing can affect the quality of the food?
I think I read something about that. It's better to freeze things quickly, right?
Exactly. Fast freezing makes smaller ice crystals, which do less damage to those food cells.
Whereas slow freezing can lead to bigger ice crystals that rupture those cells.
And that can make the food mushy when you thaw it out.
So it's not just about getting the food frozen, it's about how we get there.
The journey matters. And then we've got drying, one of the oldest tricks in the book.
Oh yeah, people have been drying food for ages.
Think dried fruits, jerky, even those instant soup mixes.
It's all about removing that water, isn't it?
Exactly. We're lowering that water activity, making it a much less hospitable environment for microbes.
So they can't thrive.
Right. And speaking of making things inhospitable, there are also chemical preservatives.
Those often get a bad rap, but they play an important role, don't they?
They do. Their main goal is to keep those microbes in check.
And they work in different ways.
Yep. Some, like benzoic acid and sorbic acid, interfere with microbial metabolism, essentially messing with their internal workings.
So they can't function properly.
You got it. And then we've got nitrite, which is crucial for cured meats.
Like bacon or salami.
Exactly. Not only does it give them that pink color, but it also keeps a particularly nasty bacterium at bay.
Which one is that?
Clostridium botulinum, the one responsible for botulism.
So that's why those cured meats can often be stored at room temperature.
That nitrite is working hard to keep things safe. And let's not forget about modified atmosphere packaging, MAP for short.
Oh, right. We talked about that earlier. That's where we play around with the gas composition inside the package.
Yep. By tweaking those gas levels, we can extend the shelf life of lots of foods.
Like those prepackaged salads we see in the supermarket.
Right. It might involve reducing oxygen to inhibit those pesky aerobes, or increasing carbon dioxide, which can have its own antimicrobial effect. We're essentially creating a mini atmosphere inside that package.
It's like we're controlling the environment to outsmart those microbes. But at the end of the day, all these preservation methods are about food safety.
Absolutely. We want to make sure those foods we enjoy don't end up making us sick.
Because while some microbes might just make food a bit unappetizing, others can be downright dangerous.
And that's when we get into the territory of foodborne illness, which can be a serious issue.
Okay, so let's shift gears and talk about those foodborne illnesses. What do we need to know to stay safe?
Well, the main culprits are bacteria, viruses, and parasites.
And they each have their own ways of contaminating food and making us sick.
That's right. But understanding how they operate is the first step in protecting ourselves.
Okay, well, let's start with bacteria then. What are the key things we need to know about bacterial foodborne illness? Viruses and parasites, they sound even trickier than bacteria. How do they usually make their way into food, and what can we do to avoid them?
Well, viruses, unlike bacteria, can't actually multiply in food, but they can definitely stick around.
And cause problems if we eat them.
Exactly. They usually spread through things like contaminated water or surfaces, or even just poor hygiene.
Like if someone doesn't wash their hands properly.
Exactly. Think about norovirus, the one everyone associates with cruise ships.
Ooh, not a good association.
It can spread so easily through food or just contact with someone who's infected.
And then there are parasites.
Yeah, parasites like Toxoplasma gondii, which you can sometimes find in undercooked meat or produce that hasn't been washed properly.
Okay, so those are definitely things to be mindful of.
And then you've got Giardia lamblia, often spread through contaminated water.
So with viruses and parasites, it seems like hand washing and sanitation are even more important.
Absolutely. Can't emphasize that enough. Thoroughly washing fruits and vegetables before eating them, especially if you're eating them raw.
It seems obvious, but it's so easy to forget.
And when it comes to meat, making sure it's cooked to the right temperature.
That's where our food thermometer comes in handy.
For sure, you want to be extra careful with those parasites that can lurk in undercooked food.
So we've got all these strategies for keeping those harmful microbes at bay. But we can't forget about those good microbes, the ones that give us fermented foods.
Right. It's amazing how we've learned to work with these tiny organisms to create so much culinary variety.
It's controlled spoilage, isn't it?
That's a great way to put it. We're directing the microbial activity to get those specific flavors and textures we want, and even boosting the nutritional value in some cases.
And this isn't a new thing either. People have been fermenting food for centuries.
Long before we even knew what those microbes were. Think about it. Bread, cheese, yogurt, sauerkraut, kimchi, beer, wine. The list goes on.
It's a global phenomenon.
It really is. And the crazy thing is, we're only just beginning to really understand the complexity of those microbial communities at play.
It's a whole other world to explore, isn't it?
It is, with implications for food science and even human health. We're just scratching the surface of what these microbes are capable of.
And it's not just about making delicious food. It's about the impact they have on our bodies.
You're talking about the gut microbiome.
Yeah, those beneficial microbes are playing a big role in our overall well-being.
Absolutely. The gut microbiome is such a hot topic in research right now, and for good reason.
The more we learn about it, the more we realize just how interconnected our health is with the microbes we consume.
It's like having a microscopic ecosystem inside of us.
And those trillions of bacteria in our gut are helping us digest food, supporting our immune system, and maybe even impacting our mental health.
It really is mind-boggling. And as we delve deeper into understanding these beneficial microbes, who knows what possibilities will open up?
Maybe even new foods, new flavors, new ways to improve our health.
Exactly. It's like we're entering a new era of food where microbes are our collaborators.
Not just something to be feared.
That's what makes food microbiology so fascinating. It's a constant reminder that there's so much going on beneath the surface, even in something as simple as eating.
So the next time you're enjoying a piece of cheese or a slice of sourdough, think about the invisible world that made it possible.
It's a whole universe of tiny organisms working their magic.
It really is. Well, thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive into the fascinating world of food microbiology. We've covered a lot of ground today.
We have, from those pesky spoilers to the microbes that make our food delicious and even contribute to our health.
It's been a real eye-opener. Until next time, stay curious, keep exploring, and remember, don't be afraid to get a little microbial with your meals.